Welcome to Co-Parenting Talk on Tuesdays. Your host, Colleen O'Neil, holds master's degrees in social work and education. Colleen is a trained divorce mediator, coach, therapist, and educator. Her practice, Mediation and Beyond in Westport, Connecticut, helps families of all phases of divorce and after. Colleen, take it away.
Thanks, John. Always a great introduction. So thank you for anybody who's watching or participating. Always glad to have you on here. So again, this is Shared Parenting's coaching, and it's not financial advice, it's not mental health advice, it's not legal advice. It's merely, I think, professional experience and personal experience at the same time. So please subscribe to our channel. You'll find us on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Sign up for the newsletter that Shared Parenting Council has. And tonight, I thought we would talk about the use of insurance benefits with therapy. And the reason I think that's important for Shared Parenting Council is because there's a lot of couples and or individuals, obviously, who go through divorce. And people's children too, who putting your kids in therapy. And I think it's such a people need a lot of support, which is totally natural around the divorcing process and around the parenting process, both before, during, and after the divorce. So I thought tonight I would clean up some. I think there's many myths out there about it and how it really works. I know when I had my therapy practice, I did not take insurance. I know when I, many years ago, had a friend of mine and she was putting her daughter in therapy, and I said, don't use insurance. And I don't even know why I said that back then, because I was a teacher and didn't know anything about the mental health process. But I always thought that that things like that, anything that's documented, obviously, having gone through a really tough divorce myself, that everything becomes part of the package. So I remember going through my divorce, and it never, I did therapy as a teenager, and I remember that my ex's attorney wanting to, threatening me that they were going to go after my high school years mental health records. And I was like, that always stuck with me. They never did. There was really nothing in them. I had several people in my life when I was in high school had committed suicide. And so therapy seemed like a good thing to utilize back then for those challenges. But just to know that somebody can, people can get like that and go after records that are really meant to support and help you, I thought would be a good thing to have, to just leave people to something to think about. And of course, you can always check with your state and your mental, your own insurance company. But I'm just going to kind of go through a little broad stroke here. This isn't meant to attack any particular insurance company. It's not to say don't use your insurance, but be mindful of when you are using it. Be mindful of and I'll go through this, the diagnoses that are given. So I've written out quite a few things because I just kind of put it in kind of bullets and things to talk about. But I remember having a therapist friend of mine who, so when you come into therapy, in order to get insurance to pay for it, every therapist has to give you a diagnosis. Most people aren't aware of that, and nor does anybody really ever ask, what are you diagnosing me with? So if someone's going through divorce or just in general comes in and they sit and I see them and they tell me, this is the insurance company I'm working with and I want to do their bill, I have to give a code. Now, most times I think people try to use benign things like general anxiety disorder or something like that, or maybe some depression, which I think if you're going through divorce, you would be depressed and or anxious, because it's a whole new field. But and I believe that most people don't need a diagnosis. I think there's nothing wrong with most people. I think people just need to come in for support. But even when you're coming in just for that supportive conversation, you're getting a diagnosis if you want your therapist to give you to utilize your insurance. So be aware that you're getting a diagnosis and ask your therapist, what's the diagnosis they're giving you? So you need to know that. But the therapist I was speaking to had a person come in, was seeing a client for a while. They were using insurance. And then that person came back like a while later and said, thanks a lot, but I got denied life insurance because I had a pre-existing condition. So you have to know what the code was that was used, and I didn't get into all that, but those kinds of things always stick with me. So most people who come into therapy think they're utilizing their insurance to kind of, curtail some of the expense, right? But so you have to weigh the pros and cons. And sometimes, you have to, as I go through this, you'll see that in reality, it might not save you much money, but might be a headache in the future. So, so there's medical necessity. And so for an insurance company to even pay for my services to that client with the insurance, it has to be deemed that there's a medical necessity. One, the medical necessity is established by diagnosing the client, which is what the therapist is going to do. And the therapist then has to demonstrate that existing diagnosis is affecting and interfering with the client's kind of daily functioning in a clinically significant manner. In order to do that, you have to write notes and submit those things to the insurance company so that you can outline why that person, much like a doctor does, why that person, your insurance is going to pay for a surgery. Well, they have to give all the documentation about you as to why that insurance company should pay for that, right? So it's kind of the similar thing. But the problem is that many of life's challenges, such as I referenced before, John, like divorce, is not really a mental health issue, right? I mean, people are seeking counseling for disorders a lot of time. You have bipolar, borderline, you have schizophrenia, paranoid, like the list can go on for real true mental health disorders. But someone coming in for support and conversation, to me, doesn't qualify as a mental health disorder. But in order to get your insurance company to pay, you're going to have to give some kind of diagnosis. So they're not going to pay for, there's no box to check. My client was considering divorce and needed to talk. Like that just doesn't exist. Or my client was feeling sad. Like that doesn't, it has to be depression. And then is that depression interfering with their life? So I think really what people in this area would have to be is that it has to be a medical necessity that goes on your record for the insurance companies to even deem it necessary and will consider paying for it, because that's not always a given. I think the other thing is that a diagnosis can have long-term consequences. Again, it's a permanent record. Like on your medical record, it's a mental health diagnosis that is on your medical record. And as I said before, it can get flagged as like a pre-existing condition. And it's important to realize that it can impact your future ability to obtain services like health insurance, because you've already, when people go, or life insurance, as in the case of that client. And we'll go on about how it can get, interfere other ways. There's also a loss of confidentiality and a kind of loss of control of your records, because once it's out there, right? So if you have a colonoscopy, you can't erase that from your record. If you have cancer, it can't be erased from your record. If someone puts down a diagnosis and you don't even know what it is, and they could have meant to write 305.2 and they wrote down 306.2 by accident. Those can be completely different diagnoses. So you want to be able to make sure you check what that is and see that it's correctly put on there. But the insurance company requiring that diagnosis, really, you lose your confidentiality. The notes have to go in. I think you have to, so with insurance, it'll tell you, and I'm going to read this because I didn't want to get this wrong. So now you have notes from each session, you have treatment plans, the goals for therapy are all in there. But this to me is the more alarming piece, is the documentation of mental health symptoms deemed clinically significant and interfering with overall functioning. That's a pretty bold statement. So I've been to therapy in the past because I've needed support around something or how to handle something in my family, or with, say, even sometimes with a colleague, at work thing. Doesn't mean it's that problem is interfering with my overall functioning. But in order to have my insurance pay, I would have had to have that deemed that my diagnosis went along with that. And they don't add up a lot of times. So one of the foundational pieces of going into therapy is that client needs to feel safe and secure. And so we all talk about having a safe space and all that. And it is true. I think most therapists are really good about providing that office space and that relationship and rapport. But everything we write down and all that goes out the window. That's not safe. So if you come in and you want to use insurance, I got to take notes and send them off. I don't really know who's reading them. I guess who's ever going to read them is going to then decide to deny or accept the claim, which they can always refute the claim, just like they can if you have any medical procedure. And I also think too, with the data breaches that have gone on in society, like you remember we had Target, Chase, Yahoo, Equifax, all the data breaches. Insurance companies are as open to data breaches as well, and your personal information. And so if you're using therapy as part of your personal information and a breach happens, that's all in there. If you're paying cash, that's not necessarily, your notes don't go anywhere, and no one's going to come in and there's more of an ability to keep notes like you'd like to keep notes, So I think it's also true of people going into the military and or people who are taking federal government jobs for security clearances. I know when my daughter, who has a federal job, I think it was probably a 100-page application, but there was quite a bit of information on there about mental health records. And so you have to answer those. And if they pull your medical file for whatever going into the military, your mental health, because you don't want unstable people too. So you have jobs now where being unstable, look at all the shootings at, the Postal Service or just, companies in general. So I think part of that, those records are not so tight anymore because people really want to know, what is this person's background? I don't know that they're privy to it, or someone could have been in an angry state at one point, but doesn't mean they're going to go up. But now you're given a diagnosis, doesn't mean that's 10 years later, doesn't mean that person's even would be ever given the same diagnosis again. Do you know what I'm saying? And so you have to be cautious on that. I also think kids.
And Colleen, I do have a question coming in.
Sure.
So the question is, do you think that there would never be a diagnosis that you'd be?
No, I do think there can be a diagnosis. I think there are. Go ahead.
That you would feel comfortable if it was out there, and that might not be too damaging to. So in other words, here's a scenario where the person who needs support during divorce, for obvious reasons, goes to the therapist and says, well, I'm not sure we should bill this to insurance. I'd like to discuss with you what your diagnosis is. And then kind of weigh, is this sort of a kind of diagnosis that's not going to cause any problems with insurance or a job or whatever?
Well, it doesn't cause any problems with the insurance. Insurance want a diagnosis, right, in order for it's the client who wants it. But I hear what you're saying. Life insurance. Yeah, but listen, if you have bipolar and you want it and you're in therapy, that should be the diagnosis. If you're borderline personality If you're paranoid, schizophrenic. Like if you have a mental health issue that is, you know, that you're going to be in, and well, you need meds for that too, but you're going to be in therapy for a while to get a footing on that. So there are reasons to use insurance, because you don't have the money to pay on your own. So I don't want this to be looked at as, well, only the people who have money don't have to do that. But the reality is, there are always, the diagnoses are real. What I'm trying to say is, most people, if you come into a therapy office, don't need a diagnosis. Yeah, I think if you're coming in to talk because you're having trouble with your sister and you guys fight a lot, I don't think that's a diagnosis. You know, if you have, and I'll get to this in a minute, but if you are in there for couples therapy, typically it has to be under one of the person's name. So like if it's John, you and I going in, it's going to be under you or I are going to get, one of us is going to get a diagnosis. And then the other one's going to be considered support, family support. So then if you and I divorce John, and we're not getting along, and let's say that therapist put me down with anxiety or depression, and then you want to run into court, and you know, because you don't know what's in the notes, or that one of those partners could have been very sad about the divorce, or very sad, maybe they were depressed about the marriage, but you don't want those diagnoses used against you. You don't want someone to get a one-up on those either. And because all you have is a diagnosis and notes from a therapist. That's it. So when a guardian ad litem comes in or something, or you have an attorney and it's going to be very litigious, a high conflict divorce, everything becomes part of discovery, right? So it becomes part of the whole process. You can take anything. And really, maybe that marriage had been sad for a long time and that person just kind of got into a slump, but it doesn't mean it would affect their parenting. But, and I guess it's not even whether it's being dragged through a process when you when you didn't really need to be dragged through a process, because being depressed would be a normalized part of going through divorce. I'm not talking about being catatonic in bed, that kind of depression where you really need significant medication and whatnot. I'm just saying that I don't think that every time you go into a therapist's office, you need a diagnosis. I think insurance companies should pay for it regardless of a diagnosis. I'm not exactly sure why you have to have a diagnosis, because it has to be a medical condition, right? It's insurance, it's a medical condition. And what I'm trying to say is mental health is under that umbrella of our medical insurance. So it has to be a medical condition. And I think there is room for medical conditions. Somebody is schizophrenic, bipolar, has a really profound mental health issue, but not if you're just coming in for support. And so I don't understand. It almost seems fraudulent to me to have to say to you after 45 minutes or an hour, okay, and now I've diagnosed you on one session, the first time I meet you, in order to get your insurance coverage, I now in 45 minutes I'm going to diagnose you. And I never felt that was an ethical thing to do. If anything, I think they ought to give you at least a half a dozen visits to get to know the client, take the history, get some interaction, really make it a good assessment, not in 45 minutes. So I do think insurance is a good thing. I just don't like the way it's struck. I think they should pay. It's part of our plan. I just don't think it should be under the umbrella of a medical issue.
Okay.
And so when you see the telehealth all the time, they never talk about insurance. Your insurance will pay. but they don't tell you that your records are available too.
Yeah.
And so I think what therapy should be, I think it should be private. I'm not sure really what the rationale is around making mental health records available to attorneys and things along those lines, but they are. I mean, you have to subpoena you, and it doesn't mean they're always available, but it is an option. And so, yeah, and in even in terms of the couples therapy, they also, you can also have a different code, which was called problems in relationship with spouse or partner, but you still need that one person to have the issue. And so, and they don't necessarily always pay when you put that code in, because that doesn't really have a medical component to it, problems with spouse or partner. So there's nothing really, there's no medical issue in that. But I think the problem I really have with is that I think people are unaware. And I think if you're going to have people come in and do that, like I was always very upfront, I don't take insurance. But everybody wants to get, they think, a financial break. And I think sometimes by the time you look at what your copay is, and don't forget, insurance may pay for 10 sessions and then you're out. Like that's it. Like sometimes insurance have a cutoff, 10 sessions in a calendar year. Well, what happens when we need to keep going? Then you feel like you've just abandoned your client. And because now you have to tell them, well, you have to, you in order for us to continue, you kind of have to pay now. Or you could be in 8 sessions in, and then you get a letter in the mail, they reject your bill. And so then that person has to pay anyways. And so there's a lot more to it. It's not just so simple as going to therapy, the insurance will pay and we're all good. And sometimes it works that way and sometimes it doesn't. I think people are very unaware though of what their diagnosis code is, or what their diagnosis code is for their children as well. Because your children will get one if you took little Johnny in at 10 because his parents got divorced and he's, maybe sad, or he's not doing as well in school, or he seems distracted, or they're going to give little Johnny a diagnosis. And that's what I'm saying. I think that's the unawareness. Not that I'm anti-insurance, not that I'm anti-codes, but maybe I'm probably more anti-making everything available, maybe putting it on, maybe making it a permanent record on our medical records. Or if you're going to do it, then I think insurance companies have a responsibility, as well as therapists have a responsibility to really explain that to people up front. And I don't think many do. I'm sure there are those who do, but I don't think we're not trained that way either.
Well, I'm very surprised to hear this, actually.
Yeah.
Because I thought with all isn't it HIPAA? Do I have that right? I thought with I'm always signing these privacy things when I go to the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that was
they can't share your medical records. That's true. They can't go share them without your consent. But when it comes to legal matters, your consent doesn't. Yes, of course. They would first ask, like, so if you and I are getting divorced, my attorney might say to your attorney, we'd like John's medical records. You can consent, great. But if you don't consent, then I file a motion to have them subpoenaed.
Okay. Is it something like that?
Then it's not so black and white.
No. And then is it something like that when you apply for a job and that job wants to know about your mental health records, and you don't have to disclose that?
You don't, but you're probably, if you're not willing to disclose, what does that say?
You're not going to get that job. Yeah.
Right. So it's not even that they get them. Yeah. But if they ask for them, do you have something to hide?
Right. And
yes, you do. It's called privacy. You don't want whatever, is written or whatever, but I'm not trying to put fear in anybody or anything along that. It's really just being aware of things we're not always told. It's like reading, it's small print that many of us don't ever read. And HIPAA is true, they sign, but if an attorney, if you're in an accident or something and someone wants to see your medical records, well, maybe that that condition isn't because of the accident. That's a pre-existing condition. And let's look at his medical records and see what's in there. So HIPAA works, but it's not just across the board where no one ever has access to anything. So I'm more of a fan of pay, and then there's just kind of no record of that. But you know,
It's too bad for the folks that just don't have the money to do
right?
it.
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
with divorce, divorce is a time when money gets very scarce. So,
Or have the conversation with your therapist up front about what the diagnosis code would be and what their note-taking system is as well.
right.
Just awareness, John.
Okay.
Just awareness. So I thought it was a good topic for tonight.
Yes, that's great. I appreciate it.
And then I think do you have anything for me? Any other questions or anything you could?
No, not really. I just I was chuckling to myself a little bit when you talked about going through divorce. Well, I mean, maybe you need some support. I mean, I went to a divorce recovery workshop way back in 1992 when I went through my divorce, and I thought the leader quite accurately described divorce as the loss of a dream. It's basically the shattering of a life dream. Because everybody, when they get married, I mean,
this is it.
we're going to live happily ever after, and we can have this typical family, or everything's going to be blessed after this. And it's quite a shock when it comes apart.
And you should be sad. I think that's normal. But I think being sad,
right,
it's normal response, right?
Right.
I think being sad, but that doesn't mean you're depressed.
right,
And those are different things. And so I don't think we should have a diagnosis for being sad.
right.
Or put the diagnosis down, sad. Like, do you understand it? So they're not so clinical. Like, put sad and put why sad, because so the response, I would think there'd be more of a problem with somebody if they came in laughing and happy about the whole thing, because that might tell me a different story about somebody, unless it's an abusive situation. But most people have a normal response of fear about the courts and their children, and they're losing their home. Those are all normal responses. And being sad that it's over, like it's alignment. It makes sense. So.
Okay, well, that's great. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
A very nice topic up on YouTube. Everybody tunes in, and of course, come back next week for
absolutely everybody
on Tuesdays. All right.
Give us some questions, email the questions, and we're happy to answer anything. And please subscribe to the YouTube channel and sign up for the newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, and we'll see you next week.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Next week. Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye.